So what I want to change is these numbers. So do you see here we have 0.5, but in the real world, you will see this more like this. So like 1/2 tablespoon of brown sugar instead of 0.5. So this looks a lot nicer, or this, for example, 1.5 is a lot nicer than 1.5. And so for that, we are actually going to use an external library which will very easily do this for us. Okay? And so I included this part so I could show you just how to do this. So let me just Google it here, npm fractional, just so we can see what this package looks like. So if you Google npm, then you will usually end up on npmjs.com, and this will then contain like one page for each package that is on npm. All right. And so here what you see is that you can basically create new fractions based on numbers, and then you can do all kinds of multiplications with them, like multiplying, dividing, and in the end converting them to a string. And so that's what we will do now. So we will convert each number to a fraction and then immediately convert them to a string. So this is how we install it. Let's just grab that. And then we need our terminal back. Let's add another one. So that's the plus sign. And this should be pretty fast, hopefully. And so we need that here. So let's import fractional from, and then fractional. And so here again, you see that any libraries or any packages that we import from npm, we don't even have to specify any path. All we have to do is to write their names here. And then here we need also what they export. And let me see what they actually export. So it should be called fraction. Okay. So this library actually exports something called fraction. And we can see that because here it is importing the fractional library using require. And that is simply the old CommonJS way of importing, which I showed you earlier. And so that is one of the reasons why I showed that to you, because, yeah, again, you will see this all the time in the wild still, because so many packages on npm are still using CommonJS. So let's import fraction here, actually like this. Okay, let's just see if this actually does exist now. And yeah, it does. So actually that's even fraction inside of fraction. But anyway, let's now go ahead and use this actually. So that is in here. So here we now no longer simply want the quantity, but we want the quantity converted to a fraction string. So according to the documentation, we have to say new fraction, and in this case, it's actually fraction dot fraction. So again, that's because here inside of fraction is where the fraction function is actually located. Okay, and here you could see that we have to then use new. Now, actually, to make this a bit nicer, we can also use destructuring here right away. So we can do this. And if we now take a look, well, now we have this bug here, but never mind. So let's just do this and then call toString on that, just like it said in the documentation. So you see that now as I destructured that fraction, it became the actual function. And yeah, here you see beautifully that it is now in this size or in this format of the fraction. And if I take a look at the other one, then the same as well. Now, this one doesn't look very beautiful, but never mind. So we cannot fix all of it, but at least this looks really cool now, right? And so this is when we reach for packages on NPM. So when we need some functionality that we don't want to implement ourselves. I'm just going back here because I noticed some problem here, which was this one. And that was because previously here we had null. So there was no value for this cilantro. And so here we should probably check if the number does exist. So we can say inc.quantity. If it exists, then do this. And if not, then simply put an empty string there. And of course not here. So that must be out here. Yep, now it's gone and it looks a lot nicer. All right. Now just to finish, I actually want to refactor this function here. So let me grab this and put it down here and call it generate markup ingredients, or just ingredient. Okay, and this will then receive the ingredient. Okay, and then here inside of the map, we can then simply call this dot, and let's copy it because these private methods, for some reason, VS Code doesn't really understand them yet. So right here. And so successfully refactored this part. And so we are now done in this lecture where we also successfully refactored the entire code that we already had to the model view controller architecture. All right. So we're not done 100%, but we've done a lot of work in this lecture. And I really hope that you understood everything that we did here. So this was a really, really, really important lecture. So make sure that you understand everything that we did. So make sure to review all the code and also compare it here with this diagram one more time so that you see which functions we call when, and then also how exactly the data flows between these different functions, and especially here in this view. Because I know that this can get a little bit confusing. And so reviewing this is going to be a very good idea, especially because we will use this so many times also in the other features. And so by then, you really must understand how all of this fits together, because otherwise it's going to be very hard to follow the rest of the project. Okay, so take your time and only then move on to the next video. Many real-world applications have two special modules that are completely independent of the rest of the architecture. And these are a module for the project configuration and also a module for some general helper functions that are going to be useful across the entire project. And so let's now implement these modules in our own project. And let's start with the configuration module. So let's maybe close this one here first. And then in our JS folder, we create a new file, config.js. Okay. And so here into this file, we will basically put all the variables that should be constants and should be reused across the project. And the goal of having this file with all these variables is that it will allow us to easily configure our project by simply changing some of the data that is here in this configuration file. So therefore the name of config. So of course, we will not want to put all the variables here in this file. The only variables that we do want here are the ones that are responsible for kind of defining some important data about the application itself. So one example of that is, for example, the API URL. All right. So this URL here, we will actually reuse in multiple places across this project. for example, for getting search data and also for uploading a recipe to the server. And so all of them will use this URL. But then imagine that at some point the URL needs to change. For example, because there might be a version 3 at some point. And so as always, we don't want to change that everywhere and simply have a variable which contains this, which we can then reuse. So let's cut this here. And you might argue that we can also simply create a variable here in the model, but then we would have all these configuration variables spread across multiple modules. But it's way easier to simply have all of those variables in one central place. And so that's what we're going to do here. So let's call this one API URL, and then paste that here. Okay, and now all we have to do is to export this constant from here. So I'm using uppercase here because this is basically a constant that will never change. And so using uppercase for that kind of variable is kind of a common practice, especially in a configuration file like this. So API URL is one of the variables that makes a lot of sense. And let's actually go to our documentation page, because indeed, as I mentioned before, we are going to use this URL for this and also for getting recipes. So then we will simply have to add the /id. Another great candidate for being a configuration variable is going to be this API key that we will generate a bit later. So let's leave that for now and go back here to this API URL and now actually import that here into the model. So import, and now remember that here we have a named import. And later we will actually also have more named imports. Okay, and so here I could go ahead and import all of them basically at the same time and then as config. But actually I prefer to import them one by one, basically with their actual name. And so remember, we do that by using curly braces and then the name of the variable like this. And then config is in the same folder. And so that should work. And here, all we have to do now is to replace, or to actually put, that API URL right here. So if we save this now, then our application, well, let's see. And yeah, it is back to working, right? And so we successfully basically exported this configuration value that we had here into this config file. Okay, next up, let's create a new file for some helper functions. So this one is usually called helpers.js, and the goal of this file or of this module is to contain a couple of functions that we reuse over and over in our project. And so here in this module, we then have a central place for all of them, basically. And to start, one great candidate is to actually create a function which will get JSON. So basically a function which encapsulates all of this and also some of the error handling. All right, so let's actually get all of this code and go here into the helpers. And so here let's create a function and export it called getJSON. And so this function is going to be very similar to what we did in the async JavaScript section. So it's going to be an async function which will basically do the fetching and also converting to JSON all in one step. And so with this, we abstract all this functionality into one nice function that we can then use all over our project. And probably we will just use this actually in our model in this case, but it's still good to have this function in this kind of central place. Okay, so anyway, this getJSON function will take a URL And so, of course, this is then what we fetch here. Right? And so with this, we can then reuse this function here for all kinds of URLs. Now this here actually already makes sense, and this one here as well. So let's now put all of this into a try block and then catch the error here. Now, what are we going to do with the error here? Of course, we could log it or alert it, as always, to the console, but let's say we actually want to handle that error here in this function. So right here, where we will actually use the getJSON method. And actually, let's do that right away. So import that first, of course. So import, and again, we are using named imports, and I simply want to import the exact variable name. So that's getJSON from helpers, and it's not appearing here, and I just noticed that helpers is actually in the wrong folder. So I put it in the views folder, but it's supposed to be in the JS folder. Okay, and so let's now actually use getJSON here, and then think about the error handling that we were just talking about previously. So here, let's say const data will be await getJSON, and then with this same URL here. Okay, and so again, this is exactly what we had done before. There's just one thing missing here. Now we get these errors, which is really annoying. But anyway, there's actually still something missing here, which is to then actually return the data from this function, right? So we didn't do that yet. And so of course, we want to return the data. And now, just as we did also in the last video, we have one async function here. So the load recipe function calling another async function, which is this getJSON function. Now this function returns this data variable, and so therefore this data is going to be the resolved value of the promise that the getJSON function returns. And if that still sounds super confusing, then you might just revisit that lecture in the asynchronous JavaScript section. But anyway, what you need to keep in mind is that here this data will become the resolved value of this promise. And so here, that's why we then await that promise and store that resolved value into the data variable. And so then the rest here is going to work in the same way. But now back to error handling. And let's say here we want to actually not alert, but to log that error to the console. Let's say console.error. And then here the error. And let's say we want to do it in a special way, just so we see which errors are our own. So using some emoji here to make it really visible. So this is here our temporary error handling, which we will improve dramatically in one of the next lectures. But anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is that the error is actually occurring here, right? It is going to occur in the getJSON function and not here. Remember that? So when there's going to be an error here in this function, then the promise that the getJSON function returns is actually still being fulfilled. So it's still basically a successful promise, even if there happened an error here. And so let me show that to you actually. So now everything works just fine. But let's now use some invalid URL here. Then we get some error here, but that's not the one we are interested in. So the actual error is this one here, and it's coming now from helpers.js at line 5, or actually line 11. So this is the error that we're logging right here. So this one here, right? So we're logging it to the console here, right in the helpers function. However, this is actually not where we want to handle that error. We really would like to handle it right here in model.js. So basically, instead of this error message here, which is simply a consequence of this first error, we would like to get this error message inside of the model, right? So do you remember how we do that? Well, we have to rethrow the error. So we have to again use throw and then simply take the error object that we already have and simply throw this new error. And so now with this, the promise that's being returned from getJSON will actually reject. Okay, and so then we will be able to actually handle the error right here. So let's try that again. And indeed, now we get that same error message that we had before right here in the model as we wanted. Okay, so we basically propagated the error down from one async function to the other by rethrowing the error here in this catch block. And that's really important to do, and we will actually come back to this in one of the future lectures. Okay, and now to finish, let's make this function here a little bit more robust and more real world by adding some timeout. So basically setting a time after which we make the request fail. And so this is important in order to prevent for really bad internet connections where then this fetch here could be running forever. And we actually already did that previously in the async JavaScript section. And so here in the controller starter code, I had already this timeout function. So we don't have to code it all over again. And so let's put that here. And so basically what this function does is that it will return a new promise. So this promise here, which will reject after a certain number of seconds. And so in order to now use this function here, we will have a race between this timeout promise, which will take whatever seconds we pass into it, and this fetch function here, which is the one responsible for getting the data. And then whatever occurs first will win the race. So let me just put that in code actually. So remember that works by using promise.race, and this takes in two promises. So the first promise is this one, and then the second promise will be timeout with a certain number of seconds. And here for now, let's just say 10 seconds. Or actually, let's just say 0.5 seconds so that we can actually test this. So here we're still getting some errors from somewhere in our code because of this error. But never mind. Oh, and now Google Chrome crashed. And here we are back. So let's just again click somewhere here. Now we still get this weird error. So let's actually check out what's happening here with cannot read property JSON of undefined. Well, maybe it's already because of this timeout here. So let's try to put it to like 5 seconds. Let's try it again. But it's got to be something else. So it seems like there is some problem somewhere here. So here for some reason is this parenthesis, which doesn't make any sense. But it is VS Code which for some reason puts it there for us. But this parenthesis doesn't make any sense because now this looks like just one element of this array. So let's just create this promise outside. So fetch promise is going to be this. And so hopefully that will fix it. Well, it doesn't. Oh, but I see what's the problem. I'm actually not even calling promise.raise. I only put the brackets there. So that was probably the reason. And so now it should work indeed. And so if we reload this, then yeah, it works. So now we can actually test what's happening here with the time. So setting it to half a second. And so that still works. And so let's make our network a little bit slower. So a slow 3G. And this should then take some time. And so let's see if we can now time out the request. So let's wait for it. And indeed, now the request took too long, timeout after half a second. Okay, so let's analyze what happened here. So we passed in half a second here, and so after that time has passed, this promise simply rejected with this error message. And so as soon as any of these promises here in the race rejects or fulfills, then that promise will become the winner. And so therefore, we now have a rejected promise here, which will then trigger the catch block here. And so that error will then be thrown again here, and then it will make its way here into the load recipe function, and eventually will be handled down here. And so that's why we get these 4 explosions down here in the error message. All right. Now, of course, then in the real world, we will want to do something with that error. But again, a bit more on actual error handling a bit later in the section. For now, let's set a more realistic value here. So of course, we don't want to time out after just half a second. Let's say like 10 seconds. Now, in fact, this is one of these so-called magic numbers or magic values, which is like a value that seems to appear out of nowhere. So if someone reads this code, they will find this number 10 and not really understand what it's doing. And so one more time, this is a perfect candidate for a configuration value. So this is really something that we might want to change about our application. And so then if we want to do that, all we have to do is to come to our config file and change that here. So let's call this one timeout seconds and set it to 10. Okay. Then here we can import that. So again is a named import. And so here we use the curly braces. So timeout seconds from helpers.js. And this import that is already here was probably put here by Parcel. So I don't remember doing this here. And so it must have been Parcel who put this here in order to make the code work. Okay. And so now here we can use the timeout second constant. And so now whoever is going to read this code will see that this is one of the configuration values. So first, because it is in this uppercase, and so that helps already with understanding the code. And then also because now it is a variable. And so it's no longer like a magic number that we don't really understand where it's coming from. Okay. And so that's exactly what this configuration file here is all about. So these are 2 important files that are used in many applications in the real world. And so make sure to also include them in some way in your own applications in the future. Okay? And now in the next video, we will kind of finish this architecture and really implement the missing part here, which is kind of handling the events in a better way. And so let's go do that right now. So let's now learn how we can listen for events and also handle events in our MVC architecture by using something called the publisher-subscriber pattern. And let's start by analyzing the code that we already have here. So right now we are listening for the hash change and for the load events right here in the controller. However, that doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Because everything that is related to the DOM, so to the view, should really be inside of a view. Now, maybe these two events here don't really look as if they have to do with the view, so with the user interface, but imagine that instead we would be handling a click event on some DOM element. And so listening for that event should for sure go into the view. And therefore we can say the same about these events here. So in the end, this has more to do with DOM manipulation or with the DOM itself than actually with the controller. And so therefore we need a way of putting this logic here into the recipe view. However, the handler function that we use to handle these events is actually this controller. So it's this function that we have up here that is sitting inside of this controller module. And so we have basically a problem here. We don't want this code to be here, so we want it to be in the view. But in this code, we need this controller function, which is here in this module. And of course, we don't want to put this function in the view. And so let's now think about how we could solve this problem. And recapping everything that I just said before, we can basically say that we want to handle events in the controller because otherwise we would have application logic in the view. And of course, we don't want that. But on the other hand, we want to listen for events in the view because otherwise we would need DOM elements in a controller. And we would basically have presentation logic in a controller, which would be wrong in our MVC implementation. So essentially, event listeners should be attached to DOM elements in the view, but the events should then be handled by controller functions that live in the controller module. And so if you take a look at this small diagram that is just a part of the architecture diagram that we already saw before, so here we have the control recipes function in the controller, and we have a special method in the view which is called add_handler_render. Now we might think that it is very easy to connect these two functions, because why not simply call the control recipes function right from the view whenever an event occurs? Well, that's actually not possible because in the way we set up the architecture, the view does not know anything about the controller. So it doesn't import the controller, and so we can't call any of the functions that are in the controller from the view. So it only works the other way around, and therefore it's more complex than this. But fortunately, there is a good solution. And this solution is called the publisher-subscriber design pattern. And by the way, design patterns in programming are basically just standard solutions to certain kinds of problems. So in the publisher-subscriber pattern, we have a publisher, which is some code that knows when to react. And in this case, that's going to be the add_handler_render function because it will contain the add_event_listener method. And therefore, it will know when to react to the event. Now, on the other hand, we have a subscriber, which is code that actually wants to react. So this is the code that should actually be executed when the event happens. And in this case, that is the control recipes function that we already have in our controller. And remember that the publisher does not know yet that the subscriber even exists, because that subscriber is in the controller that the view cannot access. Okay, but now finally comes the solution to the problem. So the solution is that we can now subscribe to the publisher by passing in the subscriber function as an argument. Now in practice, that means that as soon as the program loads, the init function is called, which in turn immediately calls the add_handler_render function from the view. And that is possible, remember, because the controller does in fact import both the view and the model, right? Now, anyway, as we call add_handler_render, we pass in our control recipes function as an argument. So essentially, we subscribe control recipes to add_handler_render. And so at this point, the two functions are basically finally connected. And so now add_handler_render listens for events using the add_event_listener method as always. And then as soon as the event actually happens, the control recipes function will be called as the callback function of add_event_listener. Or in other words, as soon as the publisher publishes an event, the subscriber will get called. All right, and this is how we implement event listeners and event handlers in the MVC architecture. So this will allow us to keep the handler in the controller and the listener in the view. And by that, keeping everything nicely separated. So in summary, the handler subscribes to the publisher, which is the listener in this case, and then as the publisher publishes an event, the subscriber is executed. And if you want to think even deeper about this and are really interested in this, then notice how there is actually a profound difference between a certain arbitrary, like function A, simply calling function B directly, and function A receiving function B as an input in order to then call that input function. So this is all about control. In the first scenario, function A is in control. However, in the second scenario, function A has no control. So it simply has to execute whatever function it receives. So if you want, reflect a little bit on that and see that this is exactly what the publisher-subscriber pattern is actually all about. But anyway, leaving that theory aside now, let's go back to our code and implement all of this. And so with everything we just learned about the publisher-subscriber pattern, actually now implementing it should be the easiest part, right? So let's simply grab this code, so cutting it actually, and then here we will create a new method. And let's just put it somewhere, let's say here. And so this will be our add_handler_render method that we just talked about. So add_handler_render, because this is going to be for rendering the recipe right at the beginning, right? And then this method, which remember is the publisher, basically needs to get access to the subscriber. And so that in this case is the handler function. All right. And so then we can simply paste that in here. And then here, of course, we don't know about control recipes, but we know about the handler. And so that's actually it for this function. So of course, it is not a private method because it needs to be part of the public API of this object so that we can then call it in the controller, right? And so let's actually do that now. So we can get rid of this now, and we will want to do this right in the beginning. So let's create an init function here, actually like this. And then we simply call it right at the beginning. So only once. And actually we could simply put all the code also here in the global scope, but I think it's a bit cleaner to have a separate function for this. That's recipe view dot add handler render. And so now we simply pass in control recipes. And that's actually it. With this, we just implemented the publisher-subscriber pattern. For some reason, we're still getting these errors here. Let's get rid of this alert here, actually, and simply do a console.log here. Okay, but now let's go and see if this actually works. We're still having our slow network. Oh, and here we have some problem, apparently, with the timeout. So let's go quickly fix that here in the helpers. So we saw that here it said undefined, like after undefined second. So maybe this variable here doesn't exist. So maybe it's kind of misspelled. So let's see in the config. Well, it looks right. Yeah, it is the same. Well, let's see again. And so this apparently happened immediately for some reason here. So what if we put it back to some normal number? Well, then it works, which is very weird because this is in fact also 10. So let's see what we get here as we log timeout seconds. Oh, but I'm actually right now seeing the problem. So this is not helpers, it is config. So we are importing ourselves here. So that was the problem. Let's put everything back. And you see that now it is working. Even with the hash change event. And so that means that we did now successfully implement the publisher subscriber pattern. Okay, and so let's quickly recap what exactly is happening here. So we can also take a look at our final diagram here. And here I actually have the event here in the controller because that is actually where it is handled. And so I think that in this diagram, this makes it a little bit easier to actually understand the flow of the program. So anyway, as we start the program, so then the init function runs, and it will then immediately run add handler render, right? So it is this function here. And it's this function that is actually listening for events right here in the view where it actually makes sense. Now, as we call this method here, so in the controller, we pass in the controller function or the handler function that we want to get executed as soon as the event happens, right? And here we then receive that function as being called handler. And so that's what we then call as soon as the event happens, right? And so again, in our diagram, that's exactly what we have here. So that's why I have this dotted line here, which stands for data flow. So we are passing in the control recipe function as the handler here. And that is the whole reason why the method here is called add handler render. So because we are using it to in fact add a handler function, and in this case, it is for rendering the recipe in the first place. And then later on, we will actually have other add handler methods. Okay, and so it's crucial that you understand this logic here before you can move on any further in this project. But I hope that with all this explanation, this became all really clear and also obvious why we had to do it like this. I mean, of course, we don't really have to do it. So we are, of course, in charge of our own code. But in order to correctly implement the MVC architecture, this is the best way of doing it. And so again, then we can keep everything nicely separated into model, controller, and view without any overlapping responsibilities. All right, so we have all of this structure here now nicely set up. Everything is nicely separated. And so from now on, all we have to do is to basically use this structure to implement all of the missing features of our application. And so, again, really make sure that you understand everything that we did so far, especially regarding the implementation of our architecture. And then once you are really done with understanding that, let's go straight to the next video. Let's now implement real-world error handling in our application instead of always simply logging errors to the console. And again, the error that we're going to work with is basically using a false ID that cannot be found on the server. So indeed, we get our error message invalid ID and then the ID itself plus the status code. Now, the real-world way of handling an error like this is to actually display some message here in the user interface so that the user can actually know what's going on. So basically, handling the error will mean to display an error message here in the view. So right now, we are handling the error actually in the model, right? So remember how I said that for now, handling the error is simply logging it here with these small emoji here. And so again, that's basically our current error handling strategy. However, it is not correct, and also it doesn't happen in the correct place. Because if we want to display something in the view, then of course that code should also be in the view and not in the model. So let's go back to our code and to our view and implement a new method here, which is going to be responsible for displaying that error message. And actually, the HTML code is already here in this like template. So it's going to be this class here, or this element with the class of error. So let's copy this, go to the view, and then let's put it here after the spinner. So render error, and then like this. And for some reason here I declared like a normal function, which doesn't make a lot of sense. And now let's create a new markup variable as always when we create some new markup, which is exactly what we're doing here. Then here, remember, we need to replace this with the icons variable. And then here, of course, we want to have like some custom message. So we don't simply want this hard-coded message, but instead we want to be able to pass a message into this method. So that's going to be message like this. And so let's add a parameter here for that. Okay. And then here, let's clear the parent element. So like this. And actually, we should do the same here. So this dot clear is a lot nicer than having to write all of this. And so we abstracted all that away into this method. And now we can basically simply get this code because it's going to be the same, right? The variable here is still called markup, and we still want to basically insert this HTML into the parent element. So that's, again, this element with the recipe class. Okay, and so that's actually it here for the view, at least. Okay, so let's now go to the model, because remember that right now we are actually handling the error right here, like this. But again, that's not what we want. So we want a way of getting this error into the view. Now, these two are only connected by the controller. And so, of course, it is going to be the controller who will call recipe view, right? So let's do that actually. So that's going to be right here in the catch block of the control recipes controller. So recipe view dot render error and then some message. But what is this message going to look like? Or in other words, where are we going to get it from? Because now we have the same problem as before. So remember, here in the helpers function, whenever we got this error, then that error was not automatically propagated down to this async function, which was actually calling the getJSON function. And so therefore, we had to rethrow the error here. So basically to mark this whole promise here as rejected, so that then here we would get into this catch block. But now we have the same problem, because now if we get an error here, then this promise, so this whole load recipe promise will also not get rejected. And so therefore, here we will never enter the catch block in this function. So it's a bit confusing, like the flow of the error and how we need to propagate it down. But essentially, we will have to do the same thing as before, which is to throw the error here again. And so with this, we will then have access to the exact same error object as we have here, and otherwise we wouldn't. So now we can use the same thing here. Let's actually get rid of this console.log. And so now here our error handling is basically finally complete. So instead of simply logging it to the console, we now have a way of rendering it to the user interface. And we will be able to access the exact same error that we also got access to here in the load recipe function. Okay, so let's try this. And indeed, here we get the error message, and it is exactly the same one that is logged down here from the model. Okay, however, this is actually not really that useful. So, well, this error is not really meaningful for anyone using this application. And so actually, this is not the message that we want. So let's create a more meaningful message. So something like, we couldn't find that recipe. Now, do you think that we should pass in that message here? So basically specifying we couldn't or we could not find that recipe. Please try another one. So again, do you think that this is the correct place of specifying this message, which will get eventually rendered to the view? Well, actually, I think that it is not. So I think that this error message should basically be an intrinsic property of the view itself. So basically, I'm going to cut this from here now. And now in the view, I will add just another private field. So it's going to be called error message, and then the message itself. And so now, basically, the view itself already knows the message that it wants to display. Okay? And then here, in render error, we will actually keep the ability of passing in a message. But if no message is passed in, then we will simply set a default. And so that default is going to be the error message that we just specified. Okay? So here we don't pass anything now. And so by doing this, we are back to having no code that is regarded to the view here in our controller. All right. And so instead, the error message is then by default set to the message, or actually the other way around. So the message argument is going to be set by default to this error message that we set for this entire object. So I think that is the best solution, which makes the most sense. And so indeed, here we now get exactly that message. And so with this, we now have a very robust and very nice error handling strategy that we will then be able to use for other errors also in the future. So for example, when there are no search results for some search term. Okay. Now, since we did an error message here, let's very quickly also implement a method here for success messages, even though we don't need it yet. But it's still good to already prepare for that in the future. And so since we are working on messages here, let's do that right away. So let's call this one simply render message. And this one here will have a different class. I think it should also be somewhere here. And actually it's this default. So this is actually the one that we will use. So it has the class of message, but then the rest of the code is actually the same. So message, and actually not the same. So the icon is also different. So here it's icon smile. So instead of the alert, it is a smile. And then here we will want some kind of message again. And so here let's now create simply yet another field called message. Could also call it like success message, but let's leave it like this. And for now, we don't have any success message because again, we're not actually going to use this for now. But message, and then the rest should essentially be the same. And then in the future, of course, we will be able to use the success message in some different places in our application. All right, and that's actually it. Let's put it back to some normal URL. We can just click here. And then, of course, everything is back to working. Great. And with this, we are actually finally ready to implement now the searching functionality starting in the next lecture. Let's now start implementing the next feature of our application, which is going to be the search functionality. And let's start by taking a look at our flowchart here. And so again, we already have this part here basically now implemented. And now we are going to work basically first on this part. So handling the event of a user searching for recipes, then loading the search results and rendering them. So that's going to be this lecture and the next one. And then afterwards, we are going to worry about the pagination. So again, we will now focus on these three parts. And so for that, we need to now implement the model, the view, and the controller that binds everything together. And usually I find it easiest to start with the data. So basically with the model, which means in this case, starting to make some API calls in order to load some search results. And then once we have that part working, we can then render them on the screen and also care about the actual event. Okay, so let's actually leave that open here at the end and go to our model here and start implementing the search functionality. So just like before, we are going to create a function that will be exported so that it can be used by the controller. And this one, I'm going to call it load search results. And so since this one will be performing AJAX calls, it's going to be an async function. Now, again, this function here is going to be called by the controller. And so it's going to be the controller who will tell this function what it should actually search for. So basically it will pass in a query like string, which we can then plug into our API call. All right. And here we are going to need a try catch block. And here in the catch block, all we will do is to basically do the same as here. So all we're really interested in here is to throw the error again so that eventually we will be able to use it in the controller. So just like before in the last lecture where we threw the error here again. So that part is easy, but now let's actually implement the functionality. And to do that, let's go back to our documentations page. And so this is how we get all recipes. So making a GET request to this path, and then with the search parameter. And the way we add a parameter, and I think I explained this before, is with the question mark, and then search equal, and then pizza here in our case is actually the search query. And again, for now, don't worry about the key. And we can actually already see what the results will look like here for pizza. And so basically, this is the URL that we need to call in our AJAX request. So let me actually copy it. And let's go back. And so now we can, just like before, use the getJSON method. And so that will then fetch the data and also convert it to JSON and create an error if something went wrong. So getJSON returns a promise, and so we await that here and store it into data, just like always. So getJSON, and then the URL, and we need a template literal. And so, yeah, now we just have to replace everything to make this work. And the first thing is to actually take this here again out and replace it with this API URL that we already have in our configuration file, right? So API URL, and I think that actually already includes the recipes. Yep, so it's everything. And usually, actually, a URL ends with a slash. So it should be like this. And so here, let's take that out, actually, and then here as well. Then here, question mark search, and then this one is going to be our query. All right, and so we can then already log that data to the console to take a look at it before we then manipulate it a little bit. And so right now, this should already be working. And so let's, before we actually write any controller or any view, we can already call that function here. So load search results. And then let's try it, as always, with pizza and see what we get. So that's right here. And indeed, this is the result that we get here. So it's coming from model at line 35. So that's where we were. And so here is the data that we get back. So we have an object which has a data property, which then has a recipes property, which is this array. And then each array contains all of this data about each of the recipes. So again, this object here is called data. Then in there is data again. And then in there is recipes, which is then the array itself, where each of the elements is an object with only some of the data about the recipe. So you see, it's not the complete recipe object. It's only some of the data so that we can actually display it then here in the search results. So without the unnecessary data like ingredients and all that. All right, so let's now take this data and store it into our state. And also we will want to change again this one here, so to image only. And so we will basically create some new objects based on this data that we receive here. All right, so we get data.data.recipes. So this is the array. So this is the array of all the objects. And now we want to create a new array which contains the new objects where the property names are different. So let's map over this. And each element is going to be a recipe. And then here we will simply return a new object. Let's actually copy the code from here because they are the same, at least some of them. So taking all this, and here now this is only called a rec. Okay, and also we don't have the source URL. We only have ID, title, publisher, and image URL. Okay, so this will return a new array with the new objects. And so now where should we store that? Well, as you can guess, we will put it also in our state. So again, the state contains all the data that we need in order to build our application. So let's call this one search. And all the data about the application that I just mentioned might as well also include the search query itself. So let's create a new object here and then specify the query, which we start as an empty string, and then the results, let's say. Results will start as an empty array. So basically the state should contain all the data really about the application. Now in this case, we might not even need the query for now, but it's still a good idea to already store it here in the state. Because maybe one day we will need it, and then the data is already there for us. For example, we might want to add some analytics in the future to know which queries are made the most. And so by then, yeah, as I said, that would become useful. Okay. But anyway, let's now store this data in state.search.results, right? And here at the beginning, the very first thing that we're going to do is to state.search.query equal to query. All right. And now let's quickly, just to see if everything worked, log that to the console. So state.search.results. And here we are. So that is exactly the kind of array that we had before. And now the image URL we had before is indeed called image. And so everything has the same format as before. So we needed to do that because here the image is also called image. And of course, we want everything to have the same names throughout the entire application. All right. So let's get rid of this because, of course, we want to call this function in the controller. And so let's go there to the controller and basically create a new function, which is going to be like the new controller. So const control search results. And so this one will call the asynchronous function load search results. And so this one, of course, then also need to be an asynchronous function itself. And so, as always, try catch. And here for now, let's simply log the error, and we will then fix that later. So here is where we actually will want to call the load search results that we just built. So that is in model.load search results. And here we then will need to pass in the query, but for now let's just do that again manually. And of course we need to await this, but we do not store any result anywhere because just like the load recipe function, this one also doesn't return anything. All it does is to manipulate the state. And so then we should be able to do this console.log in the controller and still get access to the results, right? So let's see. Now, of course, we first have to also call this function. And again, later we will, of course, hook this up to an event listener. But here, let's just call it right away. And now we get state is not defined. All right. And that is because, of course, it needs to be model.state.search.results. So you see that this is becoming a pretty long chain here. But never mind, that's not a problem at all, because we know exactly what all of this is. And so now indeed we get back our 59 search results for pizza. But now instead of only searching for pizza, we actually want to get the query right here from this input field, right? And we also want to start this whole process of loading the search results. So we only want that to happen when this button here is clicked. And so now let's basically create a view only for this search part here. So right here, we will have a view for this here, so for the search field and for the button, and then a different view which will actually render the results. So it's a good idea to keep every view really focused. And so it's best to just do one for this part and then one for displaying the results. Also because in the user interface, they're actually in kind of different places also. So it makes sense to have a different view. Now this view here is of course not going to render anything, but what it will do is to basically give us the content of this input field. So getting that input data is of course something that has to do with the DOM. And so it should be in a view and not in a controller, right? So of course, if we wanted to be lazy, we could go ahead and select the element that we want. So it doesn't matter. And then from there, we would simply get the value and then use that as our query. So again, we could do that here, but this is clearly about the DOM. And so in order to follow our architecture, we will create a new view right now. And this one is going to be called the search view.js. And just like before, here we will create a class called search view. And we will then not export that class, but export an instance, so an object that was created by this class. So export default new search view, and without passing in any data. Then, just like before, we will have a parent element. So just like in the recipe view, so a parent element, and then we will set that to something, query selector. And now let's see what we get here in the DOM, so in the HTML. So the search, it's this one. So we have this entire form, which is called search, and which has this input field here and also the button. And so I think that this is the element that makes sense to select. So the one with the class of search. So dot search. So this is our parent element here in this case. Now, again, this class is not going to render anything. All we want is to get the query and eventually to also listen for the click event on the button. But let's start with the query here. And so let's create a method that we will then call from the controller called getQuery. And all this will do is to return this dot parent element. And so again, that's going to be the search. And then from there, we want to select this input field. So this one with this class. And so let's select this child element using query selector. And then simply get the value of that. Okay, and that's actually it. And again, of course, we could have written this exact same code in a controller, but that wouldn't make any sense, because this is not concerned about the DOM at all. So we don't want to have any DOM elements in here. We don't even want to know what the DOM looks like. So actually here we have this, but we don't want this here. Let's get rid of all this clutter here actually. And now I want to get the search view here. And then here we can get that query by saying search view.getQuery. And of course, there might be no query. And so let's add another guard clause here. So if there is no query, then return immediately. And so here we will now no longer look for pizza, but for query. Now, if we run this, then of course there will be no result because, well, right now there is nothing here to be found. So that controller function runs right in the beginning when the application actually loads. And so by then, of course, there is no value here. And so in order to actually make this work, we now need to listen for the event of basically clicking this button or submitting this form. And then only on that event, we want to actually call this controller function here. So not in the beginning when the script loads. So in order to do that, we will once again use the publisher subscriber pattern. So basically exactly what we did here, right? So we will listen for the event in the view right here, and then pass the controller function, so the handler function, into the method that we will build here. So this add handler search method here is basically going to be the publisher, and the control search results function is going to be the subscriber. Okay, so hopefully you really understood that pattern that we used before, and so this now should be obvious. So let's take our parent element, so this dot parent element, of course, and then this is where we will actually add the event listener. So not to the button, but really to the entire form, because there we can listen for the submit event. And so then this will work no matter if the user clicks the submit button or if the user hits enter while typing the query. Now here we cannot simply call the handler immediately, because remember, as we did many times before, when we submit a form, we need to first prevent the default action, because otherwise the page is going to reload. So prevent default, and only after that we can call the handler function. And as you already know, this handler function should be the control search results function. And so all we have to do now is to call this method and pass in that function. So let's do that here right at the beginning. So search view dot add handler search. So you see that I'm always going to use this name here of add handler. And then we pass in the controller function. And that's it. So now it should actually already work. So let's see, and actually let's clear up all this clutter here a little bit. Okay, so this console.log, and there's also some here in the recipe view. So that's this one. Okay, so let's again try pizza. And yeah, beautiful, it worked. So we get this data first here coming from the model, and then also in the controller we also logged it. And so here we have the exact same 59 data that we had before. Let's try something else now. Avocado, let's say. So I hit enter, and so this time we got 39 search results. And you see all of them basically have avocado right there in the title. That's really beautiful that it already works this great. Now just one small detail is that after we search, we should probably clear out this field. So let's add another small method for that in the view. So in this one here, so clear input, and once again, having it nicely encapsulated inside of the search view. So again, this could simply be also in a controller because it's really just one line of code, but we want to keep everything separated. This will make it so much easier to add features in the future, and it's really so much better. So all we do is to set this to empty, and that's it. All right, let's try it one more time. Let's say pasta this time. Of course, we never called the method here anywhere. So we need to do that in the controller And let's actually add some more comments here. So get search query. And the code itself is actually pretty self-explanatory. And so many developers will tell you you should not comment it. But I think that this is actually very helpful when you read the code in like 1 or 2 years from now. So I would advise you to always write comments like this, even if your code seems pretty obvious, especially when it's like a bigger list of instructions like this. So render results. So right now our rendering is only a console.log. But here, when we get the search query, we can actually then immediately also clear it afterwards. Or in fact, in order to keep this controller even simpler, we can do that right in the getQuery method. So let's go back here. And now we can make this private. So we're not going to use it outside. And then let's actually call it here. So this dot clear input. And then of course we first need to store this somewhere here. So we get the query, then we clear the field, and then we return the query. All right, so that should now work. So pasta, it clears the field and gives us our 45 results down here about pasta. Great, so that works just fine. And so all there's left to do is to now implement actually the view. So the second view basically, so the one that is responsible for then rendering all the results here in this sidebar. And so that's going to be a little bit of work, so let's leave that for the next video. Let's now render the search results by creating a new view. So we already have the search view, but now we also want to create like a results view. So a results view which will contain a render so that we can then call that render here with these search results. So similar to what we have here, so to the recipe view, which also has a render method which takes in some data. And so now, again, we want the same for a results view. So we also wanted to have a render method which takes in data and which is then rendered to our user interface. So let's create the results view.js. So results view. And so now this view will actually be pretty similar to the recipe view. So we don't need that one anymore. But now, again, this one is going to be very similar. So we will have a parent element, data, these messages. We will basically also need the same render method, the same render spinner. So we will need to display the spinner while the data is being fetched. So in this case, the search results. We might need to also render an error. And so now it's time to basically refactor this code and create a parent class. So I had mentioned that before, but now it's actually time to do it. Because by creating a parent class, we will then be able to reuse all of these methods on all the views. So basically on all the objects that are created through all the view classes. So let's create yet another file here. And I'm calling it view.js. And so let's create a new class here called view. And so we will then export immediately this class. And actually, let's make it a default export. So this time we are actually exporting the class itself because, of course, we are not going to create any instance of this view. We will only use it as a parent class of these other child views. All right. Here in the recipe view, let's now import that parent class. So import view as, or actually not as, but from view. And actually we don't even need the JS, but I like to keep it there for consistency. And so now all we need to do is to basically copy everything that should be common to all the views to that parent class. However, there is one thing that we still need to change here. And that is that right now with Parcel and Babel, inheritance between these truly private fields and methods doesn't really work yet. So here it was nice to actually use the native way of JavaScript of protected methods and properties, but now we cannot really use it anymore. So maybe that might be possible at some point in the future, but for now we will have to go back to protected fields and protected methods. So let's basically select all of these hash symbols, and actually I will select them like this, so with the dot, because otherwise that will also select these ones. So hitting Command D here a couple of times, and then replace it with dot underscore. And now we just have to change these method names. So changing from truly private to only protected using the underscore convention. And then the same right here. Okay. So now our code should still be working. It says here connection lost, but indeed our code keeps working here. Okay. Let's just check out the search view. And so let's use the same convention here as well. Okay. Just here as well. And now here we also converted everything successfully. But anyway, let's now basically extract the view class from this recipe view. So what we need in all the views is this render method, then this one as well, this one, and basically everything except for generating the markup, because that of course is going to be unique to every single view, right? And also adding the handler. But everything else we want to be the same on all the views. For example, rendering the spinner will be really easy. So all the views will simply have this method, and we will then be able to call it on that method. And thanks to the parent element property here, it will then know exactly to which element it should attach the spinner. Because again, the parent element, of course, will be unique to each single view. So the parent element will be unique, the message, so these two messages, but this data can actually also be on the parent. So let's copy all of this here, or actually cut. So everything except for adding the handlers and generating the markup. So let's put that here. And here we of course then need to extend this one. So extends view, right? And so let's see if we have everything still in place. Yeah, so I'm confident that this will work now. So let's see. Oh, and icons is not defined. So let's go back here to our view where we will have to copy this one. Because here, of course, we are also using the icons. Okay, but here it is. All right, so we successfully extracted the view class from the recipe view. And now all that's left here is really what is unique to this view. And so this makes this even easier to work with, in my opinion. Because now let's see what we can do here. So even without any code yet in the results view, we will already be able to add a spinner to the search results. All right. Well, we cannot really leave it empty. We still need actually the parent element here. All right. And we also need to import the view. So import view, and then this is just another child class of view. Then here we need to say that parent element should be, well, something, and let's check out what it actually should be. So here in index, let's see. So it's this here. So this result element, so this unordered list. All right. And then basically each of the search results will be one of these preview elements. But more about that later. So for now, let's just set the parent element to this results elements here in result view. So document.query selector results. And then we have to export default just like before, and then a new instance of this view. And so this way there can only be one results view. And then here in the controller, we can immediately import that without having to create the instance here manually. So that's results view like this. And so now here we should already be able to load the spinner, or actually to display the spinner. So let's do that at the very beginning. So results view dot render spinner, and let's see what happens. So pizza, and here is a small error. And so let's once again do some debugging here. And I hope that you can appreciate that I'm actually not cutting out all these like small debugging sessions so that you can actually see what I'm doing here. But anyway, apparently the problem appears here in Vue.js at line 14. So right here, so it seems like it cannot find the parent element. So let's simply log that to the console. So this here is the result of doing that for the view. And now let's see. So now that is undefined. So to me, it seems like here we selected the wrong element here, maybe. So results. So that should actually be correct. And so should the name. So I think parent element is correctly spelled. Oh, but it's actually called parent element all written out. Okay. So you see it's actually called parent element like this. For some reason I thought it was called just like the abbreviation. Ah, and you see here is the nice loading spinner spinning away here in our search results, right? And again, all without writing any new code for displaying that spinner here in the results view, because it is now simply inheriting that method, so that render spinner method from its parent class. So let's get rid of this. And just for the sake of curiosity, let's actually take a look at this results view. So just so we can see the whole prototype chain here in the console. So for that, we need that controller to run. And so here it is. So you see that we have still some undefined data. Then we have the parent element, so the one we selected. And then we get, well, right now we don't have any methods in the class already, but we do have methods in the parent class. And so these are the ones, right? So the render one that we're going to use next, then render error and spinner and message. So it's always good to remember these things so that we still know how everything actually works behind the scenes. But now it's actually time to create basically this generate markup method also in the results view. Okay, so all the child views should have this method here, because in the view, the render method then actually relies on that. Okay, so this dot generate markup needs to exist in order for the render method then being able to create the markup and render it, or to insert that HTML into the DOM. And so let's take that, just that name, and create that right here. So as always, add template, literal, and then now it's time to actually get this code here. Okay, and this here is called a preview because we will actually use the same thing later here to render the bookmarks. So that's going to be a nice trick, but we will save that for the future. Okay, some more indentation here on all of this to make it look great. And so now we need to take our data and actually put that right here. Now, where actually is that search results data? So with all of this structure, it might be a little bit hard to follow where that data is. So let me actually start by calling the render method here. So here, besides of simply logging the search results, we now also want results view dot render, because of course, just like render spinner, the results view also inherits render, and then into that we pass whatever we want to be rendered. And so that is all of this. Okay, and then in the render, here we see that it takes this data and puts it into this .data. And so here, if we then take a look at the results view, let's simply log that then to the console. So this .data. And so this .data here should basically be exactly this search results. So let's see. And it is. So you see that twice we now get this array. And you also see that it already printed something here to the results. So that is that pre-formatted HTML that we already created here. So it's already basically this HTML, right? Because this method here is already returning that. And so then the view takes that data and renders it on the user interface. Okay. And so let's now actually create this method. Now, this is actually an array now, and so here we need to loop over that array. So in fact, we don't want to return simply this, but instead we want to return a whole string which contains like one of these elements for each of the search results in the array. So we will return basically this .data, and then we map over it, remember? So we did that before with the ingredients. And then at the end, we join everything together. And so then that will be the string that we return here. Now, we could now go ahead and put this code here into the map function. But instead, I will create just another method down here to make this a little bit cleaner. Let me copy this name. Preview. And I'm simply calling it this, because that's also the class name. So let's put this one here. And so then here we can call the method. Oh, what was that? So we can call it right here then. And so now this should like print 50 or 60 of the same. So just to see if it works. And indeed, here it is. So 59 results, and so it prints this 59 times right here now, right? Now all we need to do is to fill it with the real data. So with the ID, image, publisher, and title. Okay, so to start, we need the ID here in order to build the link. And so then when we click the link, that will change the hash in the URL, which in turn will trigger loading a recipe. So that's what we did by the beginning of this section. Now here we need to pass in the result then. And so here that is result.id. Then here it's the image. So .image, here it's the title. And then here the publisher. Okay. Now here we also need to replace the icons. So we will need, again, the icons right here. We will probably need them in all of them. So but that should be it. And it works. Beautiful. So we get all of these search results here. We just have to fix some small details. But you see that it's already working. And now let's click on one of them and it works. Minimizing this a little bit. And so you see that now we get exactly the recipe that we are clicking on here. So watch what happens with the ID when I click here on pizza casserole or casseroli or whatever. So it changed the ID up there and changed the recipe here also in the view. Great. Now let's just fix this icon here and actually also here. And then also all of these should not be highlighted. We will take care of that a little bit later. So we need to take away this class here of active. And here we also need to take away this. Okay, and we will come back to this later again when we actually start to implement uploading our own recipes. And here in the alt text, we should just put that title as well. Okay. Now you see that actually the state that we had here before in the page is gone. And so let's activate that hot module reloading that I mentioned in the last section. So remember that with Parcel, we can do this. So if module.hot, then module.hot.accept. All right. And again, this is not real JavaScript, at least this module.hot. This is simply coming from Parcel. All right. And now finally, let's also delete these fake links that we had before. Let's reload. And that looks a lot better. Okay. So let me now change something in the code. For example, getting rid of this console.log here. And so previously that would then reload the entire page. But now as we go back, you see that the state here actually remains. All right. All it says is the console was cleared, but that's it. So the rest remains the same. And we can now also delete this user icon from the recipe view. So let's see where that is. It is simply this div here. And so once again, it will now not re-render everything. Well, maybe we should re-render. And yeah, now it's gone. Well, it also messed up our button here for some reason. So maybe that was not intended. Maybe I should just remove this here. So basically keeping an empty div. Okay, so for the time being, let's just leave it like this. Okay, now let's just see what happens when we search something that for sure does not exist. So you see that here we still get a success. You see? So we still get that data, but the only difference is that the recipes array is now empty. And here we also see that the array is empty coming from the state. So in this case, we actually want to render like an error message here saying that there was no results for that query. So let's start by creating also the error message property here. So let's copy these two actually to our results view. And here let's say no recipes found for your query. Please try again. But now, how exactly will we actually display this error message on the parent element? So we could do that right here in generate markup and basically check if the array is empty, and if it is so, then render the error message. So that would work. However, we can also do that directly in the render method. So automatically right as we receive the data. And I believe that is what makes more sense. So right in the beginning, when the render method is first called and receives the data for the first time, we can immediately check if that data actually exists. So right now, we only simply assumed that there always is data and that we can then generate some markup with that data. But as always, it's a good idea to check if the data actually exists. And that is true no matter if we receive a simple object or if we receive an entire array of objects, which is the case of the results. So let's add a guard clause here. So if there is no data, then we want to return immediately, and we also want to render the error. So we can do that all in one line, and this will then still work. So this dot render error, and we actually don't even have to pass in any message because we already automatically get the message from this dot error message. And so in this case, that is going to be this one that we just specified before, right? Now, however, in this case, this check is actually not enough because in fact, we do get data. It's just an empty array. And so in this case, we also want to treat the empty array as though we had no data. So this here basically only works for undefined or for null. But now we also want to check if the received data is an array and if it is empty. So we can do that by saying, so if there is no data or, and then basically if the data is an array and if it's empty. And we can do that by using a helper function that is on the array constructor, which is array. So we can check that. And so if it's an array and the length of the array is 0, basically, data.length 0, well, then in this case, exit this function immediately and also render the error. Okay? So again, if there is no data, or if there is data, but that data is an array and it is empty. So in both these cases, we want the error to be shown. So let's check that. So with pizza, it all works the same because there are results. But now with this, there are no results, and then we get our error message. So, great. That works. And so I think we are done actually with this part. So just one more look at our flowchart. So we implemented the event that the user searches we asynchronously loaded the search results, and then we also rendered them to our user interface. And so with that, we are done. Right? Just a final look here at the controller, but everything looks good. So in the next lecture, we will actually take care of the problem that we have these 59 results all one after another here. So that's not good. And so we will implement pagination in the next 2 lectures. Welcome back to the next feature of the Forkify application. And this one is going to be pagination. So let's take a look at our current implementation of the search to get an idea what the problem is. So you see we have 59 results for pizza, but now all of these results are displayed here basically at once, right? And so this is not user-friendly at all. So in the final demo application, we only have 10 results on this page, and then we can go to the next page and basically get the next 10 results. And so that's what we want to do right now in our application as well. Now this problem is actually harder to solve than it might seem like. But I'm sure that together we can do it. So let's think about what we have to do here. So remember that it is the control search results function that is responsible for rendering the search results right here. And currently, we are simply rendering all the search results like this. However, in the first page, we only want to render 10 results and not all of the results, right? And then if we're on page 1, we want to render the second 10 results. So from result 11 to result 20. And so let's basically create a function in our model which will take in the page that we want to render and which will then only return the results that we actually want to render for that page. Okay? And that's actually not so difficult. So let's create a new function here and also export it. And let's call it get search results page. So a function. And this one is of course not going to be an async function because we already have the search results loaded at this point. So at the point when we will call this function. All we want to do in this function is basically reach into the state and then get the data for the page that is being requested. So what we will return here is basically a part of the results. So let's write that here because that will be helpful to understand the logic we need to write here. So we will return state.search.results, which remember is this array here, right? And then we only want to return part of it. And so that's a slice. So again, for the first page, we would like to return from result 1 to result 10. And so that would be 0 to 9, actually, because the array is 0 based. Now, of course, we're not going to hard code these values here, but we can basically calculate them based on the page. So let me try that. So we will basically create a start variable. So let's set that to 0 for now. So basically having the same values as here. And also an end variable. So we want to start at a certain point and then also end at a certain point. Right? But again, we don't want to hard code these values, of course, but instead we want to calculate them dynamically. So here we will want a 9 and here a 0. And so how can we calculate that? Well, the easiest way that everyone does it, or at least I think that's the way that everyone does it, is to take the page and then -1, and then simply multiply it by the amount of results that we want on the page. So let's say 10 here for now. And then here we do the same simply with page. So page times 10. Okay. So let's say that we requested page 1. So 1 minus 1 is 0, and 0 times 10 is then 0. So just as we wanted. And for the end parameter, then page is 1 times 10 is 10. And actually the slice method here does not include the last value that we pass in. And so actually 10 is perfect here. So that will then extract all the way to 9. Now, one page is 2. So for page 2, then here we will have 2 minus 1 is 1 times 10, 10. So it will start at 10 and then go to 2 times 10, which is 20. And the same for all the other pages that we pass in. And so this is actually already it. Now let's just refactor this code because, of course, this here is an important data about our application. And so it should go into the state. Okay. So let's call that results per page. And so let's set it to 10. So here instead of 10, we have state.search.results per page. So that's a lot better. But actually we can do even better because this here now looks kind of like a magic number, right? So a number that comes out of nowhere. And so I think you can see where I'm going with this. So I will create another constant in our configuration file. And then if at some point in the future we want to change the configuration, in this case of the results we want per page, we can simply come here to the configuration file and change that. So let's import that. So that's right here. Replace that here. And so that should work just fine now. Okay. And now let's go back to our controller. And so again, this is the way we did it previously. So all the results, but now we only want some results. And so we can now call that function that we just created. So model.getSearchResults. And then let's say we want to start with page 1. And of course, we will then later on get this value here dynamically. But for now, we just want to see if this actually works. So let's see. And let's search here again for pizza. So again, 59 results. But we still get all the results here for some reason. So let's only log this here to the console. So just to see what our function here is doing. Well, apparently it doesn't really do anything. So get search results per page. I think that is the correct name. So that should actually work. Well, let's just log something here just so we see if this function is actually being executed. So start and end. Well, nothing is happening here for some reason. Maybe we need to stop parcel. Sometimes that is necessary. And then run it again. So let's build it all again. Let's also try it again. And now it seems to work. And indeed, now we only get 10 results. So sometimes you actually have to stop and restart parcel. This isn't the first time that this has happened to me, and probably I should have warned you about this problem also earlier. But anyway, now we see that this actually worked. So great. Then we can get rid of this and also of this console.log right here. Okay, now let's try something else.